so much. I love you so much. I love you so much. I love you so much.
Hello, all you positive heads out there. Thanks for tuning your beautiful brainwaves into another episode of the Positive Head Podcast, where we are firmly convinced that creating success and happiness is rooted in understanding the ultimate nature of reality and the fact that as human beings, we are all immensely powerful fractals of the one and only source consciousness, which creates and animates all things. Now, of course, understanding this powerful truth is one thing. Applying this incredibly empowering wisdom to everyday life? Well, that's another, which is exactly why we provide you with a fresh serving of soul food for thought 5 days a week to help constantly remind you of what matters most. You are it. And I'm your host, Brandon Beecham. I'm the reflection and extension of you who will be here each Wednesday interviewing a different consciousness changemaker. And on the other 4 weekdays, leading the way to ensure that your perspective is consistently expanded, your vibration is constantly elevated, and your heart is overflowing and full. Also, before we jump into today's episode, I'd like to take about a minute and a half to tell you about a few sponsors that not only help to make it possible to produce this show 5 days a week, but that I'm also genuinely passionate about promoting. The first longtime stellar supporter of the show that I want to mention is Gaia. If you're not familiar, Gaia is the go-to source for streaming consciousness content online with over 8,000 video titles. And you can sign up for your first month for only 99 cents at gaia.com/positivehead. That's spelled GAIA.com/positivehead. The second sponsor I'm sincerely passionate about promoting is Purium. It's no mystery that bringing your mind, body, and spirit into balance is necessary if a person truly intends to manifest the greatest and grandest version of themselves. So if you've been looking for a way to easily get organic superfoods into your system every day with a simple plan that can help you reestablish a healthier foundation and relationship with food, like I was doing before I found Purium, I highly recommend going to positivehead.com/transformation and checking out the videos and interviews there where I dive deeply into discussions explaining why I take these products every day. And should you ultimately end up on iShopPurium.com to purchase any of their 50 plus amazing superfood products, be sure to use the code POSITIVEHEAD, all one word, for a 25% discount. All right, all you positive heads. On this week's Soul Share, I'm very excited to have Dr. Hank Wesselman here with me on the show. Hank is an author who has an absolutely fascinating spirit walking story to share, as well as a lot of inspiring insight into the Hawaiian shamanic path. And super excited to have you here, Hank. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Yep, here I am. And warm greetings from Hawaii Island. It's a beautiful dry season day here, although we're getting a little sprinkle this afternoon. This is sort of par for the course. So it's nice to be online with you.
Absolutely. You know, I'm here in Southern California outside of Los Angeles, and we are, as I like to put it, stuck in the best we're in a wonderful season to be stuck in, but we don't get a lot of drama in our weather. And I remember my time in Hawaii, a lot of rain, and I for one, really enjoy the rain. I know some people think it's a bummer. To me, I think it's refreshing. And so, enjoy that.
Well, you know, here in Kona, in South Kona, you know, we're dependent upon the rain. And this is dry season here right now. So, you know, when we get sprinkles in the afternoon, this is always a good sign. But, right. You know, it's interesting to be on the phone with you today because the Spiritwalker story is a very unusual story in the sense that, you know, I'm a very mainstream anthropologist. I was trained as a zoologist initially at the University of Colorado at Boulder And then I went for my degree in anthropology at UC Berkeley in California. And, I caught the eye of a big name professor who was running an expedition in East Africa, which was searching for the fossil evidence for human evolution. And he saw me as being a paleobiologist, which is what I became. And, it was out there in the deserts of southwestern Ethiopia. I'd be out there for like 3 months at a time. And, living in a tented camp, I began to have these strange visionary experiences. And, they were, they sometimes happened at night when I was supposedly asleep, but I really wasn't. Classic out-of-the-body experiences. And then sometimes they happened during the daytime when I was very much awake. For example, I was excavating a site in 1972 that was about 3.5 million years old. And it had all sorts of fossils in it, fossil giraffes, fossil antelopes, fossil turtles, fossil fish, as well as bits and pieces of early proto-hominids, in other words, early forms of fossil man. And I had 3 African men working with me. One of them was a shaman. He was a man of the Dasnich tribe in southwestern Ethiopia. And I was told by my colleagues that he was a shaman and that he was a crocodile whisperer, in the sense that he could talk to the crocodiles who lived in the Omo River. And these were huge. I mean, we're talking about 20 feet long. They were as big as dinosaurs. They were man-eaters. And he could sort of, assuage them or enchant them. And he could swim across the river if need be, and the crocodiles would not eat him.
Wow.
So, I was quite interested.
That's a man who trusted what he did. Like he believed in himself to do that one. That's pretty brave.
Yeah, I was, quite interested in him. At that time, I didn't know very much about shamans, but I knew a little about them because I was an anthropologist, and so I remember one day I was digging at this site. And we were planning to go back to camp for lunch because it was 115 degrees. I mean, you could cook eggs on the ground. It was so hot.
Wow.
And 2 of the African men who were Wakamba tribal men from Kenya, they were loading the equipment back in the Land Rover. And I got this creepy feeling that I was being watched by something. Now, when you're out in the Rift Valley in the desert, this is, something to pay attention to because, there are lions, there are hyenas, there are leopards, there are buffalo, and, they're dangerous.
Right.
So
much less something watching you beyond the veil. You've got plenty to worry about in 3D when you're in Africa, right?
That's true. And so I remember standing up very slowly and dusting myself off and looking under the brim of my hat. I had a bush hat on, and the shaman was looking at something off to my left. So I turned my eyes slowly in that direction, and I saw something. It was big, and it was about 6 feet off the ground. And as I turned my attention fully in that direction, it was though it stepped through a tear in the fabric of the air and zipped it closed from the other side, leaving a momentary wrinkle, which straightened out and then was gone. And I thought to myself, Jesus, Hank, it's time to go back to Nairobi for a beer. I'd been out in the bush for 3 months. It's one thing to, camp over Labor Day weekend and go home on Monday night for a shave and a shower. It's something quite different to live in the desert for 3 months at a time. And so, this experience haunted me.
Wow.
I asked Atiko.
What did it look like?
Well, I asked the shaman, Atiko, in Swahili, I said, Atiko, kwanini? I said, what is that? And he gave me this long measuring look. And then he said, he pointed at the place that I had seen it. And he said a single word, Shaitani. Shaitani is the Swahili word for spirit.
Wow.
And so, I digested this, but in those days, I worshiped solely at the altar of science, and I wasn't really interested in spirits. And so I wasn't sure what to make of this. But, this experience haunted me for many years. And 10 years later in Berkeley, I was finishing my PhD dissertation, and I found myself at a workshop. A friend of my wife's called me, and she said, Hank, there's an anthropologist coming to Berkeley, and he's going to teach a workshop in shamanism. You're going to love it. It's just your thing. Well, I wasn't too sure about that. But, there was something in me that remembered that account, that happening that happened in Ethiopia. And so I ended up at the workshop. And the first day I was there, it was the great Michael Harner himself. And many of your listeners know who Michael Harner was. He passed this last year. But he was one of my important teachers at this point in my life. And, he was drumming. He was doing shamanic drumming. And I wasn't getting very much. I kept expecting there to be sort of a flat screen TV that would go on inside my head. And I'd sort of watch it like a film. But, what happened was that I went home at the end of that first day, and my wife asked me, how'd you do? And I said, I don't think this work is for me. I didn't get much. And she said, maybe you're not doing it right. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, you can visualize, can't you? And I said, yes, I can. She said, well, can you erase the screen of your thinking mind and create kind of like a whiteboard? I said, yeah, I can do that. So she said, okay, erase the screen and stop thinking. And then she asked me to bring up an image of the American flag. And I did.
Right.
And so she asked me, is it stationary or is it moving? And I said, oh, it's moving. It's snapping in the wind, and it's the rope is hitting the flagpole, and I can hear it going clawing, clawing. And she said, I didn't ask you to see it moving. I just asked you to see a flag. Right. And I thought to myself, oh. And then she said, erase the screen again. So I did. And then she said, can you bring up an image of a flower? Well, I did. It was the season that irises were blooming. So I brought up an image of an iris. And she said, what kind of a flower is it? And I said, it's an iris. She said, I didn't ask you to see an iris. Where did that iris come from? And so, I suddenly realized that I was, involved with something where I could start with an intention and then a visualization. And then what would happen is the visualization would take on life and things would start to happen, which I wasn't making up. Right. Well, I went back to the workshop the next day and I was the champion. You
had your technique down now, huh?
I found myself paired with a young woman with long dark hair and dark eyes, slender, very attractive. And her name was Sandra Ingerman. Now, I mention that name because many of your listeners will know who Sandra Ingerman is. She's become a very important teacher in the shamanic tradition. And so I found myself paired with Sandra Ingerman, and we were doing an exercise in which each one of us would journey on behalf of the other in order to find a helping spirit to come into relationship with us. And so she went first. And so there I am lying on my back in the dark, and It's a dark room, and Michael Horner is blamming away on his drum to help us achieve visionary states of consciousness. And, I'm lying there and I'm worried. What if Sandra doesn't find anything?
Right.
And suddenly she sits up and gives me this intense look in the darkness and leans over and blows into my chest. She plants her mouth on my chest and blows into my heart. And something happened.
Wow.
I got goosebumps all the way down to my knees. And then she blew again into the top of my head. And at the end of the drumming, she told me about the visionary journey that she's just taken on my behalf. She told me about journeying into the mythic lower world, which is the dreaming of nature. And there she encountered a being that said it was one of my old friends and wanted to come back into my life once again. And what she described was one of my childhood imaginary friends, the one that I called the Leopard Man. And I called him the Leopard Man because he used to stand up on his hind legs like a human being. And, he was my sort of secret friend, kind of like Calvin and Hobbes. Remember Calvin and Hobbes?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Calvin was this little boy, and Hobbes was actually a stuffed animal, a tiger. But for Calvin, Hobbes was real, and they used to have adventures together. That was very much like what happened to me as a child.
Interesting.
So when she mentioned the Leopard Man, I was stunned because, nobody knew about the Leopard Man, Brandon.
Sure.
This was my personal, imaginary friend. And this got my attention. And so this was the beginning of my entryway into the shaman's world, onto the shamanic path. And of course, what happened next is it's kind of legendary as a way, because I wrote this book called Spiritwalker, which was actually
one of
followed
the first
by two more books, Medicine Maker and Vision Seeker. It's actually a trilogy. And it's the story about how I was drawn into a visionary series of adventures by connecting with a man who lives in the future. Yeah. This is a man who may, in fact, be one of my descendants. In fact, he may be one of my descendant selves. Right. And to come right to the point, I was able to discern that this man lives about 5,000 years after the collapse of Western civilization. And when I first connected with him, it was like I was him.
Right.
It was like I could understand his language through his understanding of it. I could understand his world through his visioning of it. And he was in the process of leaving his community, which is somewhere on the western coast of North America. Interestingly, he's a man of Hawaiian descent who was being trained as a kahuna. And, he was a visionary himself, and he was leaving his community to go on a long walkabout into the interior of the lost continent of America, because in his range of time, there are no cities, no freeways, no Americans. The whole of Northern California is covered with tropical forest, of really impressive dimensions. And so he was leaving to go on a journey of investigation, and I would hook in with him periodically over the next 4 or 5 years. In fact, this still happens to me today. Really? As he journeyed across the inland sea, which is the Central Valley of California, filled with water, and through the great forest, across the mountains, and into the what we call Western Nevada today, the how can I describe it? It was a wooded grassland when I saw it, a wooded grassland, and there were people that lived there, and they were the descendants of the once great civilization of North America. Wow. And he lived with them for about a year. This is what the Spiritwalker story is all about. And to say I was astonished would be an understatement of vast proportions. I was literally stunned. I went into kind of shell shock. I thought I was losing my marbles, that I was losing my mind. And, this is an extraordinary story about a scientist, me, a mainstream scientist, who was drawn to become a visionary and who had an absolutely extraordinary experience. And Brandon, you've read this book. What could you say about it?
It's the reason I wanted to reach out and have you on the show, Hank, is because when I began my own spiritual journey, going back 20 years ago now, this was one of the first books I read, which was Spiritwalker. And to me, nowadays, of course, I've been doing this show for going on 4 years and have so many people on who have just had incredible stories and tales to share. So it's sort of like my life now, right? But back then, it was the beginning of my own journey. And I was reading and learning and opening up and having these, epiphanies about the ultimate nature of reality and whatnot. And, hearing your story, it was the first time I'm like, what? What really got me was, hold on, this person's obviously a highly intelligent, scientific mind, a doctor. Like, this is not, sure, they could be making it all up, but I don't think I believe he believes this happened, And so, and of course, since then, I can tell you, last 2 weeks ago, a good friend of mine, told me how her whole life now, her lucid dreams and her waking life are like commingle. And she was sitting at a piano the other day and saw a ring on the piano, and it all of a sudden catapulted her into a life in the 1800s where she was at the piano. And the woman in the 1800s was sad because her husband had just left, and she started playing the piano. And when they were so linked up, my friend in this time started playing the piano in the same song, but she never learned how to play. She just knew how through the connection to this other self. And so, nowadays I'm connecting with people all the time. And of course, she's a brilliant, talented individual who is not, you wouldn't meet her just much like yourself and think this person's off the rocker. You would think the opposite. Wow, look at your life. It's really together. You're really gifted. You're really, an amazing artist, all these things. So it really is just an incredible experience that seems to be, yours was one of the first I ever heard, and probably the deepest as far as, as you said, it's a trilogy of books where it just goes deep down the rabbit hole of your ongoing journey. And to hear that it's still unfolding for you, I find absolutely fascinating, because you originally wrote Spiritwalker in the mid-90s, right?
Yes, and it developed into a trilogy. The second book was called Medicine Maker. The first book is really about my walkabout, my sort of spiritual crisis. The second book is about how I became a kind of wandering medicine man. And the third book, Vision Seeker, is about training. It's about my training in the shamanic tradition and about Nainoa's training in the Hawaiian tradition, because this man who lives in the future is named Nainoa.
Right.
Now, what's interesting, Brandon, is that after Vision Seeker was published, the visionary experiences came to a close, and nothing happened for about 7, 8, 9 years.
Oh, wow.
And I thought, well, it's over. Right. And I had created my books in my slice of time, and he'd created his books in his slice of time about our
he wrote about you
together.
He wrote about you in his time.
Well, he knew about me because he began to connect with me in reverse.
Right.
In other words, he began to find himself in my body, in my frame of time, looking at my world through my eyes.
What a trip.
And we got to know each other rather well. And it was really his
pretty
idea.
Intimate.
Again?
I said pretty intimate. Yes, that would make sense.
Well, it was really his idea that I might be one of his ancestors.
Yes.
His immediate impression was that he had hooked in with one of his ancestors.
Right.
And that I was an American who lived in the home islands of Hawaii before the fall of our civilization. So, nothing much happened for about 7 or 8 years. And then one evening, actually it was close to dawn, I was in a hotel room near the freeway in Sacramento, and I felt this incredible force, this incredible pressure, which I've described in my books. It came on, and he was there in my mind, and he needed information. And so our connection started up again. So, Brandon, I'm in the process, believe it or not, of creating a 4th book in this trilogy. And I decided to engage in an experiment. I decided to ask Nainoa to write the 4th book.
Wow.
And he's in the process of describing his life and his time. And I'm transcribing what he's writing. And of course, I'm cleaning up his syntax and grammar and morphology and creating the narrative in what he thinks of as Old English. It's not Old English like for us. Old English was from Chaucer's time.
Right.
But Old English is a language which he knows, so we're able to actually communicate in that language. And because he's a scholar like me, he's a clerk. And so, this is an absolutely extraordinary experience. And, I'm hoping I'll get the 4th book done within a year or so. It takes me about a year or so to write one of these babies.
I bet.
But, I know that many of your listeners have actually read the Spiritwalker books. And so this will give them something to look forward to.
Yeah, it definitely gives me something to look forward to. So let me ask you this. When you're connecting with him, and I don't recall, of course, it's been a long time since I read Spiritwalker. And so when you're connecting with him, even now, is it sort of you go and set the intention, like go in a meditative state, or does it happen sporadically and it just sort of overcomes you, like you talked about happened after 7 or 8 years? All of a sudden, out of nowhere, he was just abruptly there. What is your process now?
Well, it's like all of the above.
Yeah,
there are times when suddenly this feeling of pressure or force will come into me, and I found my body completely paralyzed. It often happens on the heels of a joyous marital encounter, if I could put it that way.
I think I know what you're getting at here.
I say that.
Oh,
but, I discovered that the mystical ecstasy and the tantric ecstasy, they're very close. They're very similar to each other. And It's very easy to step from one into the other.
Right.
And there is also the shamanic journey work that I do. I've been teaching workshops for the last almost 30 years. And, it's interesting, Brandon, because what I've discovered is that I use the drum to help people achieve connection with the visionary state. And then I'll give them some coordinates. And with a very, with very little effort, I can send people off in my workshops on visionary journeys. And they'll come back like 15 or 20 minutes later with accounts that would pass muster at any Aboriginal campfire. I mean, These are non-tribal Western people, and they seem to be able to vision very much like traditional shamans. And this has given rise in my mind to the idea that there is some kind of program on our inner hard drive. I'm talking about our DNA. And when this program is double-clicked with the right mouse, like the drum or the rattle, or the hallucinogen if one was used. It allows people to go into visionary states of consciousness very easily. And I think it's one of our birthrights, the ability to vision. And, this is something which I continue to do, traveling around the country. I teach at places like the Omega Institute in New York.
Right.
At the Brighton Bush Hot Springs Conference Center in Oregon, Mosswood Hollow, east of Seattle. And, we have incredible times together in these visionary circles. I draw in the other mystics in our society and give them a few directions, a few coordinates, a little bit of background, a little bit of assistance, and off we go into the other world. And,
Wow.
it's been absolutely extraordinary. I've met the most incredibly interesting people, and I could just say that they're much more interesting than my academic colleagues in the fossil man field.
Right. Right. I take your word for that. Yeah, it really is something. All right. Well, now seems like a good moment to take a quick minute to tell those of you who aren't familiar a bit about our sponsor, Gaia. I've been a big fan of Gaia for many years now, which is why they're the only content provider I've ever reached out to in regards to potentially supporting this podcast. So needless to say, I'm very excited they're now supporting the show. Gaia truly is my personal go-to source for streaming consciousness content on the web. They have an incredible 7,000 plus exclusive videos covering 5,000 years of wisdom. Just to give you an example, on the show Missing Links, the incredible researcher Greg Braden explores all the biggest questions concerning who we are, where we come from, where we're going, by connecting the missing links between science and spirituality to complete our understanding of humanity's history and to better understand the interconnectedness of all things. Awesome, right? And that's just one example. As you guys constantly hear me say, it's a daily conscious effort to maintain an elevated vibration. And if you're looking to go deep down the rabbit hole to do so, then Gaia is the best place I know of to do it, period. And you can sign up for your first month for only 99 cents at gaia.com/positivehead. That's spelled GAIA.com/positivehead. Check it out. And would you agree? I mean, you've been on this sort of journey for quite some time now. Would you agree with the statement that there is sort of a quickening happening, or a thinning of the veil, where more and more people seem to be easily accessing these states?
I would indeed. And I think the word quickening is quite appropriate. There's a kind of a quickening that's going on. And more non-tribal Western people like ourselves are waking up to the fact that they have this program on their inner hard drive. And more people are accessing the dream time, what the Australian Aboriginal people call the dream time. And they're having really interesting experiences. The fact is that, society at large is not overly receptive to these kinds of experiences. And so when I had them as a child, I learned, fairly early on that most of my friends and other little boys couldn't do it. This was quite astonishing to me because I was able to do something that they weren't able to do. And so I learned how to keep my confidence to myself.
Right.
And I think a lot of people in our society are kind of closet visionaries who have these extraordinary dreams or dreamlike experiences, and they don't share a great deal about it with others because they're afraid of social convention and being judged as weird and so forth and so on. But I find that in response to my books that I've written, and, Brandon, I've been very lucky. I've got 9 books in print right now. The most recent one is called The Reenchantment. And it's about how I was reenchanted and how it drew me onto a shamanic path that led to a life of wonder. And there are a lot of notes, field notes from my visionary experiences in that book, some of which are quite extraordinary. I remember one that, as I began to do this work, it became easier and easier and easier for me.
Right.
And sometimes it would happen all the time, sometimes when I was very much awake. And, I remember being in an airport boarding gate believe it or not, an airport boarding gate. Can you imagine that?
Yeah.
And I'm sitting in this boarding gate waiting for my flight, and I've got about a half an hour at my disposal. And I'm kind of looking around at all the people, and the woman next to me in the seat was reading the Wall Street Journal, and she was dressed for success and so forth and so on. She had a little cross around her neck. And, I decided to just sort of close my eyes and go into the visionary state, which I did. This is a very easy thing to do once you know how to do it. And so I went into the visionary state, and I had an extraordinary experience right there on the airport. And I've described this in the book, The Reenchantment. If I've got this right, and I believe I do, I had an extraordinary experience with none other than the Spirit of Jesus of Nazareth.
Wow.
And it happened in an airport. And I saw him just as clearly as I could see you if we were sitting in the same room together.
Interesting. I got to throw out a real quick synchronicity. Right before you said Jesus, I was watching this show recently called American Gods. It's just a TV show that depicts godlike, all kinds of different godlike characters, in a fun narrative. And there was an episode where there was a Jesus-like character that appeared in the episode. And for some reason, right before you started to tell me, as you started this story, I started for some reason thinking about that particular episode, and sure enough, a moment later you went right into saying none other than Jesus. So that was pretty cool for me. It just popped in my head.
Well, it's important to understand that these experiences are available to all of us. Yeah. This isn't something which is just the possession of the few. Okay, in the old days, the visionaries among us were relatively few in number. But today, these visionary experiences are available to more and more people with a minimal amount of training and background to encourage them to go in this direction. Right. And on that occasion, I had this incredible experience in no less than a boarding gate in an airport. I mean, can you figure it?
Yeah. What was your experience, your particular experience with Jesus?
Well, these transpersonal forces, which we call spirits, they're around, and they're around all the time. I remember when I was in Egypt in 2003, I took a travel group. In fact, I've taken 3 travel groups to Egypt and done ceremony in the Great Pyramid, among other things. But on this occasion, I had a travel group in Egypt, and we went to a huge temple along the Nile south of Luxor, which was called Dendara. Mm-hmm. And this was a huge temple dedicated to Hathor, who is the old kingdom version of Isis. And I've always been interested in Isis because my friend Sandra Ingerman has an ongoing relationship with the goddess Isis. And so on this occasion, I found myself touring this great big temple, and then late in the afternoon, I found myself outside walking around this immense building, and I found this ruined shrine behind the temple. And I asked our guide, what was this? And he said, oh, this is a shrine to Isis. So, this is all I needed. Being involved with the shaman's path, I walked up and into this shrine and assumed a relaxed position and a meditative state of consciousness, which is what I think of as the shamanic state of consciousness. And it was in that situation that I was able to close my mind and extend my conscious awareness toward the goddess Isis. And believe it or not, I had a connection.
Wow.
Now, you know what happens when you get up in the morning and you open the door of your refrigerator or your freezer and this cold air flows down onto your bare feet?
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is what happened in this shrine. It's like this cold air flowed out of this shrine and flowed over me. And in my mind's eye, I saw this blue field, a field of blueness. And I was aware of the fact that that field of blue was and is the goddess Isis. And
Wow.
I had an extraordinary encounter. This encounter is also described in my book, The Reenchantment. You know, one of the things that's interesting, Brandon, is that those of us who are visionaries, we have a heavy responsibility because when we have these experiences, our job is to write them down, to get them down and get them right. You know, it's one thing to hear about other people's visions. It's one people to read about other people's visions. But when you've had the awesome jolt of the real thing yourself with these transpersonal forces on their own ground, it changes you. And it changed me as well. So although I'm still a mainstream scientist, still doing mainstream science, still reconstructing paleo environments for early man sites in the Rift Valley in Ethiopia, you know, I also have this visionary ability, and I find myself kind of like a wandering medicine man, connecting with other Western visionaries, other Western mystics, and encouraging them to engage in visionary experience themselves. And, you know, it's been just an incredible adventure.
Yeah, it sounds like it's been an incredible adventure, and one that just continues to unfold for you. And of course, a lot of content that you've shared in all these books. And you know, what I'm kind of curious, I imagine I could probably talk to you for 24 hours straight and be fascinated about, you know, hearing everything that you've went through and experienced. But you know, since we don't have that much time, what would be some of the highlights for you as far as, you know, I know with Spiritwalker, for example, it was messages from the future, and there was sort of a theme that wanted to be shared. And, you know, is there something that, you know, out of everything that you've been through that you would sort of distill down as the key message that wants to come through at this time?
Well, you know, I wrote a series of books. The visionary books about the Spiritwalker experiences were 3. And then I created a small book called The Journey to the Sacred Garden, which you can read in an hour. And it's got a CD in the back with my drum and my rattle. And people have found it to be very, very useful in opening that inner doorway. It was followed by a book I co-authored with my wife called Spirit Medicine, which is about shamanic healing. You know, healing work is very, very important because we've all come to be of service. But knowing how to do it is also very important. And so this book, Spirit Medicine, includes many of the trademarks, many of the tools that we use to, you know, facilitate healing in people who are suffering from afflictions that may be inflammatory, they may be chronic, they may be terminal. We don't really have any idea. But that book was followed by a book I wrote with Sandra Ingerman called Awakening to the Spirit World, The Shamanic Path of Direct Revelation. And this, I think, really is the best book on shamanic practice on the market right now. Of course, I'm sort of guided to say that because, you know,
Slightly
I
biased.
co-wrote the book with Sandra. But that book got the gold medal as the best body-mind spirit book of the year from the Independent Publishers Association, which is the largest competition involved with books toward the North American market. It got the gold medal award for the best book of the year. It was followed by a book called The Bowl of Light. And the bowl of light is about my relationship with a Hawaiian Kahuna mystic over the last years of his life. We were friends for 8 years, and during that time, he conveyed an extraordinary body of knowledge to me. At the beginning of our relationship, since you've asked me a question which I can answer, he gave me a wooden bowl, a Hawaiian bowl, and he said, "This is your bowl of light." He said, when each one of us comes into the world, we come in with a bowl of light. And this is the light from our higher self, from our oversoul, that divides. And it sends in a bowl of its light that takes up residence within us and nourishes us and sustains us during our life here on planet Earth. He said, but as we pass through life, sometimes we step into the negative polarity. Sometimes we take things that don't belong to us, or we achieve success at the expense of somebody's failure, or we, we become who and what we are. And in the process, we injure other people with our thoughts and our words and our deeds. And he said, every time you do that, it's like you put a stone in your bowl and some of your light goes out. He said, slowly but surely, our bowl of light begins to fill up with stones. And he said, hopefully, we learn what we're doing before it's too late, before our light goes out. And he looked at me and he said, you know what you do then? And of course, I'm sitting with this man with a beard down his chest, a ponytail down his back, a carved walking stick, an aloha shirt, and we're sitting right on the edge of a volcano crater, which was his office. And I said, what? What do we do next? And he took the bowl back from me and he turned it over and he said, we dump it out.
Yeah,
we
good
clear
answer.
The bowl. And he burst out laughing. And he said, but at that point, that's the point when we become spiritual warriors. Mm-hmm. And he used the word warrior with deliberation because he was a military warrior in the first half of his life. And he was kahuna on both sides of his family. Kahuna is a word which implies mastery in the Hawaiian language. He was a spiritual master. And so he became a kahuna mystic in the last half of his life. And he said, when we step onto the path, the mystic path, we become spiritual warriors. And as warriors, our life is constrained by 3 sacred directives. Mm. And I waited. Yeah. And he looked at me and he said, the first directive is to love all that you see with humility. Mm. And I'm thinking to myself, whoa, easy one first. And he was psychic. And he just laughed and he said, listen, I worked on that one for 7 years. To love all that you see with humility. The second directive is to live all that you feel with reverence. Mm-hmm. With reverence. And this reverence is not just, like a convention. It's about an active respect for everything and everyone that you encounter in life. And the third directive, to know all that you possess with discipline, because that's where we find our self-discipline. And self-discipline is very important when you step onto the spiritual path. This is where so many of the gurus stumble, and you know about that. We don't have to name any names because many of us know the stories. But this is our path, Brendan. To love all that we see with humility, to live all that we feel with reverence, and to know all that we possess with self-discipline. This is our path.
I love that. And it's so beautifully summarized, and it covers all the bases, doesn't it?
It does.
Wow. So let's see. There's so many things I'd like to ask you in our limited time here. So, obviously, this journey continues to unfold. I mean, is there any, I guess one thing that comes up for me as soon as I hear about your story with Spiritwalker is this idea that sort of, not so far distant future, 5,000 years, you have, where North America has sort of went back to being very, sort of the collapse of Western society, it sounds like. How and what sort of insight have you gotten into this idea of different timelines? Like maybe, you know what I mean? Where, your future self that you've continued to connect with, this individual, I'm forgetting the name off the top of my head, it may be in one particular timeline, but then, could there be a whole different timeline where 5,000 years into the future, you have a version of North America that is highly, advanced scientifically speaking, and with robot technology at a whole different level, and you hear about those sorts of visions and so forth. So I'm curious if you've had any of that sort of visioning, and what your thoughts are on alternate timelines.
Well, if I've got this right, and I believe I do, there are many alternate timelines which are available to us. There are many possible futures that are available to us. But the future that we're walking straight into, if we continue to do business as usual, is Noah's world. And so the Spiritwalker books will give readers a really good look at the future that we're walking into. And, it's just a matter of time in which everything that we take so much for granted is gone. And a new cycle begins. A new cycle of ages begins. And, the interesting thing is that in Spiritwalker and the books that followed, Medicine Maker and Vision Seeker, I addressed the science of climate change. And when I began to address this, you might see a story on climate change maybe once a month in the New York Times. Well, now you see one once a day in the New York Times. And it's very much in our faces. And so I've addressed, the issue of climate change and what we're looking at it. And if I've got this right, and I believe I do, and I don't mean to sound, negative or doom speaking by saying this, we're past the point of no return.
Right.
We are past the point of no return. And what we now have to do is adapt to the changes that are coming. And these changes will be quite catastrophic. For example, we're aware of the fact that Antarctica is breaking up. There was a large story in the New York Times science section on Antarctica just a day or so ago, and about how, the meltdown is beginning, the big meltdown. And when that meltdown happens, and it happens completely, it will probably raise sea levels somewhere between 160 and 200 feet.
Wow.
Now, that is not a small change. That will inundate all the lowlands where, human beings are living. I'd say that probably at least 10% of the human population lives within feet of the coastline. This is, of course, the primo coastline. And, the sea level has begun to rise. And so this is not a small thing, and it requires our real attention to this and what we're going to do next. So that's also covered in the Spiritwalker books. And the amazing thing is that the predictions that I made 25 years ago in this book, Spiritwalker, are happening. And they're happening just as fast as I predicted they would. Science has been caught with their pants down on this one. Nobody perceived that the computer modeling for climate change would happen as fast as it is. But the fact is that it is. And this is very serious. So it's something to pay attention to, don't you think?
I would absolutely say it is. And, not to invoke fear, like you said, I did just notice the other day that they moved the doomsday clock. It's like 2 minutes to midnight on the doomsday clock now. And it's a very fascinating and somewhat, I guess I find some peace in knowing, that what should be will be, and I'm going to do everything in my power to help, cause the best and spread people's awareness to, because I think a big part of it is if more people were aware that all is interconnected, the more we would be treating the earth with respect and not just looking to what can I get and how can I sort of rape and pillage Mother Earth. And it seems like that awakening and awareness is definitely happening and spreading, but like you said, it's it'd been a lot better if it came about 100 years ago, right?
Yeah, it would have. It's true. The people have been largely ignoring the science. We're living in a time in which people are not all that interested in science or human evolution, for that matter. But the fact is that science doesn't deal with belief systems. Science deals with facts. And those facts are immutable. They're unchangeable. And so it's time for us to really pay attention to the science. And we're all going to find out what happens next.
Yeah, exactly. Now, in your interactions with Nainoa, has he given you a lot of insight into what the history books show? You know what I mean? Is that a sort of rabbit hole that he went down, sort of sharing what happens when, where, and how, or is it just sort of a high level, it collapsed?
Well, he doesn't really know, because history tends to be written like 2 or 3 generations after something happens. And what he does know is that in the Hawaiian Islands, which is where his people came from, that there was a sudden rise in the sea level, and there was social chaos in response as, large areas of land were lost. For example, I'm aware of the fact that if the sea level rises just 1 foot, 12 inches, the coastline of Waikiki will be a mile inland.
Wow.
And all those big hotels will be standing in the water. This is very serious. So he knows that. But, beyond that, what happened was now, 5,000 years in the past.
Yep.
So we kind of look back from our perspective, and we're aware of the great flood myth that Noah and his family survived.
About 5,000 years ago, right?
Yeah. Fact is, when I was researching the Spiritwalker story, I was able to find 89 cultures in the world who had a great flood myth. So the great flood happened at the end of the Ice Age, when, the sea level rose approximately 300 feet above what it is now. And, this is the great flood that everyone, talks about in their mythology. And we tend to think of them as myths, as stories, but in fact, they're not.
Right.
We know, for example, that the Black Sea was really formed when the big meltdown occurred. And by doing underwater archaeology work, they found entire communities which were inundated by the water when it rose. And they're still there, standing in 100 feet of water. This is something I think we should pay attention to. Yeah.
Yeah, I would have to agree with you. It is something that we need to pay more attention to. And like you said, I suppose we'll just see where it all unfolds. And all we can do is as much as we can do, I suppose, at this point. And so as we sort of start winding down here, Hank, is there anything in particular that you feel, called to share that, what would be the most helpful thing for those out there who are early on this path that are just starting to open up to having, awakening to the spirit world, if you will? What sort of advice and thoughts would you want to sort of, portray to them?
Well, I like to reinforce the idea that virtually all of us have a birthright that we came into this world with. And that birthright includes the ability to vision, to achieve visionary experience, and to experience the dream time, the other worlds. And this is where, so much resides in relationship to ourselves, as well as, the interlife state that we go into when we cross over at the end of life. And so I would encourage people to develop that capacity, to develop that ability in themselves, and to love all they see with humility, to live all they feel with reverence, and to know all that they possess. And that includes what possesses us, with discipline. These are really words to live by, don't you think?
I absolutely agree with you, Hank. Definitely words to live by. So for those who would like to connect with you and continue to follow your work, and, what is the best way to do that?
Well, I have a website, sharedwisdom.com, sharedwisdom.com, sharedwisdom.com. And, I'm on Facebook. And, I spend a lot of time on social media every day because people connect with me there. In fact, I receive more emails through Facebook messaging than I do from my several emails accounts. My email is hank@sharedwisdom.com. And excellent. I'm more than willing to field questions and emails from the folks at large. One of the most important things that we do is to create community. And that's one of the things that you're doing, Brandon, which is very, very important. You're creating community. And this is not a small thing, don't you think?
I very much agree with you. As the more we can come together with like-minded souls and, support one another, those of us who are really focused on making the world a better place, leaving a better place, better than they found it. I saw a quote the other day and it said, someone is really starting to understand, I'm paraphrasing it, but essentially it said, that someone is really starting to understand life when the man who plants trees that he knows he'll never sit under. And that's a sign of someone who's really getting it. And I think by coming together and creating community, uplifting and supporting others, on their own journey back to remembering who and what we truly are, and this whole, fascinating idea and reality that's unfolding for so many, that this is just one of countless lives that we live. And it's sort of like all these other rooms. We've been living in the same room in a giant mansion, and now the other rooms are starting to open up for many people. And I just applaud the work that you've done in being sort of a forerunner in helping to lift the blinders, if you will, for so many of us.
Well, thank you very much. It's nice to hear, because, one of the things that the Kahuna mystic Halemakua said to me years and years ago, he passed over in 2004. He said, we've all come to be of service. Now, this is a very important thing. We've all come to be of service. And that's just a question of what that service will be and how we're to offer it. So I'd like to leave your listeners with that thought. Yes. This is not a small thing either.
No, it is not. It is not, Gandhi said, if you want to find yourself, lose yourself in the service of others. And I love that. And I like to always add to it, the reason is because there are no others. That's the reason it works and it feels so good. And it's what at our deepest core, I believe we all are looking for, our own unique way to serve the whole, which is really just an extension of the one, right?
So thanks for the work that you do, Brandon. It's not a small thing. You're creating community with your show, and I applaud you for doing that. So thank you very much for your support in my work, and I'd like to support your work in turn as well. So blessings on you and blessings on all your listeners.
Oh, I so appreciate that, Hank. And I do have one final question I'd like to leave you with. And the question is this. In 60 seconds or less, what is the meaning of life, according to Hank Wesselman?
The meaning of life. The meaning of life is twofold. It's always twofold. There are always two possibilities. Right. First of all, we were brought to this beautiful planet to enjoy ourselves, with the accent on the joy. And secondly, we were brought here to remember our divine origins through the experience of love for one another. And that's really what it's all about, don't you think?
I couldn't agree more, Hank. You are a treasure, and thank you so much for connecting here today. Until our paths cross again, journey well, my friend.
Okay, and aloha nui to you. Nui means big.
Thank you, my friend. Well, everyone, that concludes this week's interview episode. Before we sign off, I wanted to let you all know that we have finally created the Game with the Universe on our website, where you can choose the first number that comes to your mind, and it'll pull up that episode number of the podcast. I've been saying this is a great way to co-create synchronicity and magic with your higher self for quite some time by doing this manually. But now if you go to positivehead.com/YO universe, there is a super fun and simple interface to play this game with your higher self. I firmly believe just by setting the intention to play in this way, it opens up the door for magic, and it's a synchronistic way to hone in on nuggets of wisdom out of the huge catalog of episodes that are specifically appropriate for you at this time in your journey to becoming the next greatest and grandest version of yourself. And it also makes for a super fun way to engage and invite friends, family, people on social media to check out the podcast as well. So be sure to check out positivehead.com/YOUNIVERSE, and be sure to tell all your friends so they can play a game with the universe, which also helps the show to reach new people, which I greatly appreciate. And as a quick reminder, be sure to also check out positivehead.com/transformation if you're curious to learn more about Purium superfoods and why I take them every day. On this journey of becoming the next greatest and grandest version of ourselves that we have all embarked upon, I can't stress the importance of managing your physical vibration enough. And quite honestly, Purium has put together the simplest plan I've found to do so, and I'm sincerely excited to share it with all of you. Otherwise, as you continue on your fabulous journey in this 3D reality, be sure to remember this. As long as you ain't dead, you're already positive ahead. Journey well, everyone, and thank you for being.